Hi, I'm Emily Previti, and this is Folo PA, the Pennsylvania Capital Star's podcast focused on policy affecting Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. There's been strong public opposition to data centers in many communities where they've been proposed, including in Pennsylvania, and about 80 data center projects are in the works statewide, according to the crowdsourced website trackdatacenters.com. And they're at various stages, from the preliminary exploratory stage where land has not even been acquired yet, up to construction being underway, as is the case for 5 of these projects. My colleague Peter Hall looked into a few of them and spent time in their possible or would-be host communities for a story he recently published, and made time to talk more about his reporting. Pete, thank you for being here, and congratulations on getting this story out. We've been referring to the story internally as the Tale of 3 Townships because you focused on 3 where data centers have been proposed: Muncie, which is in Lycoming County, Middlesex and Cumberland, and Anthony Township in Montour County. So how did you decide on those particular communities, and what got you interested in pursuing this story and framing it as you did?
I wanted to highlight the different ways in which communities are responding to data center projects. And Montour and Cumberland were 2 that I was familiar with from previous reporting. But I also wanted to get one that was a very recent proposal where the township and people who lived there were in the early stages of coming to grips with how they had to respond to it. And Muncie received its proposal in April of this year, which I think makes it one of the more recent ones in Pennsylvania. The township supervisors had undergone a bit of turnover in the last election. I believe they had 2 new supervisors on a board of 3. They set out to pass a moratorium on data center proposals. And as soon as they were able to put together a meeting to vote and pass on that, the developer in question in Muncie rushed in with an application the day before the meeting. And so they're in a bit of a legal mess there right now. It's unclear whether the moratorium that they voted on means anything. And the developer has filed papers in county court saying the township didn't act on their application in a timely fashion. So now they're arguing that it is deemed approved by the course of inaction.
So you go to these 3 different places. What was the landscape like for the properties that were being eyed as possible host sites for these facilities?
Middlesex and Muncie are what I would describe as semi-rural or suburban. They've got major roads passing through. Middlesex is right outside of Carlisle, which is a Harrisburg suburb. And Muncie is just 10 miles from Williamsport, which is a sizable city up in that part of the state. The Lycoming Mall, which is really now a zombie mall, largely vacant, is just across the road from the proposed site of the Muncie data center. And in both Middlesex and Muncie, the projects are proposed on what's current or former farmland, still open fields, but they're surrounded by homes and businesses. Really, the only way to describe Anthony Township in Montour County is rural. There's not much there but farms and a nature preserve that's owned by the power company. But just across the border from Anthony Township is Derry Township, and that's where Talon Energy has the Montour Power Station, which is pretty large. It's 1.3 gigawatts, and the owner has plans to nearly double its capacity in the next few years. So the thing that all 3 sites have in common is that there's a nearby energy source, whether it's a transmission line that cuts across the property in Middlesex or a gas pipeline that runs close to the Muncie site, and then there's the power plant right there in Montour County.
In that case, you have another business entity locally that's has expansion plans tied directly into the prospect of this happening, which is not always the case, right?
Yeah, the power plant there has a lot of excess capacity, is what I understand, and it would be available to power a data center. I don't know for sure that this is what's planned there, but in some other cases where data centers are situated right next to power plants, they use what's called a behind-the-meter connection, which means the electricity is flowing straight from the power plant to the grid, to the data center. It never goes across the power grid that all of us use. So it can be a more efficient way to connect data centers to power sources.
So would that mean that customers, and one of the concerns is customers being affected because obviously if demand goes up, then the price is going to go up. So would that insulate people to a certain degree with respect to that specific data center with the way that that is set up, or unclear?
Well, there are efficiencies. By having the data center close to the power plant, you cut down on the amount of transmission infrastructure that's needed. It also means that that data center is not competing on the market with the rest of us for electricity, which, of course, is subject to the laws of supply and demand. It doesn't completely insulate ratepayers from the sort of economic effects of higher demand, because if that power plant that's connected directly to the data center is sending all of its power to the data center, or most of its power, then that power isn't on the grid for regular users. So it's not an answer to that concern completely.
Got it. Okay. So often one of the things that we hear when someone's proposing a data center is, oh, it's far away from everything, or it's this former mining site that nothing else can be done with. What did you hear, if anything, about possible or preferred alternate uses for some of these properties?
All three of the sites are open land. It's undeveloped, aside from farmhouses and outbuildings and things like that. But the Middlesex site had been the subject of a proposal to build around 1,200 or 1,400 homes. The CEO of Pennsylvania Data Center Partners, which has the plan to build in Middlesex, said their proposal was a gift-wrapped present for the township compared to the demand on schools and other services that the new homes would bring to the community. Muncie is a little different. The land had been sold off from a larger farm about 30 years ago because a local hospital system wanted to build a senior living facility there. That never materialized, and the land changed hands a couple of times, and it's now held entirely by this one developer, Daniel Klingerman, who wants to build 3 data center buildings on the site. Montour County, the land that they're looking at, or were looking at to rezone there, is owned by Talon Energy, and that's a Texas-based energy company that they own power plants and they sell the energy. They don't deal with local distribution or sending people electric bills or anything like that. They're what's called a merchant generator. And they bought the plant years ago from PPL, and it came with a lot of vacant land around it, including a nature preserve, the Montour Preserve, which is a big part of the community there. But the land is zoned for agriculture, and that's one of the factors that folks I talked to said motivated their opposition, was the tremendous change it would have on the landscape. And on the other hand, you have the pressures of agriculture, and it's hard work, and some people see an offer for their farmland and they see it as their ticket out of farming, if maybe that's not how they see the rest of their life going. So there is an interesting dynamic in a place like Anthony Township.
You mentioned Daniel Klingerman, the local regional developer, making the pitch to develop the data center in Muncie. So often there's a dynamic, that we'll pick up on a little bit later, but that it's outsiders coming in to do this sort of thing in a community, or it can be, and he's a local person. But what is his history in that area?
I asked to interview Dan Klingerman, but he didn't respond. He was recently appointed to the board of the Little League World Series, which happens nearby in South Williamsport, and he's the founder and head of the Liberty Group, which is a private equity holding and investment company in Williamsport. But he really made his name developing hotels, and I think that's what people know him for. But the company's holdings also include office and warehouse space. And interestingly, he has personal ties with Senator Dave McCormick, the Republican Pennsylvania senator, who's been a major proponent of data center development. Klingerman and McCormick wrestled together in high school in Bloomsburg, and they recently made a joint contribution to a scholarship fund that was established in the names of McCormick's parents at Bloomsburg University, where Rick's dad was the president back in the 70s.
That's a super interesting connection. So early in the story, you mentioned a ghost mall. And for me, when I saw that, I clocked the theme of communities being exploited. Albeit with a mall, it's going to unfold differently, and did. And the impacts are not the same as some other examples we might think of, like fracking or mining. So how do data centers fit in here?
Well, that was meant to draw a parallel to the different types of development we see and the public opposition to it. I'm only 48 years old, and most malls were built long before I was ever really paying attention to public discourse over land development. But my understanding is that there was a lot of opposition to shopping malls because they tended to clear out downtown business districts and leave ghost towns behind. And so it's a type of development that had a great impact on the communities where it occurred. And data center developments, they're different in that it's a black box. The average people around aren't going to know what's going on inside, but they do have all of this infrastructure. You have big concrete buildings that are, hundreds of yards long and wide, and they come with supporting infrastructure like water tanks and, in some plans, hundreds of diesel generators or natural gas generators that will, undoubtedly create noise and some level of pollution. That can have a transformative effect on a neighborhood. And so I think there is a parallel there. Lycoming County has been the epicenter of a couple of big extractive industries in Pennsylvania's history. There was a huge timber industry centered around Williamsport, where forests were leveled, and they may have grown back in places, but, it's never the same. Then about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we had the advent of fracking in Pennsylvania, and that came with all kinds of impacts on the water and other resources in the area. And John Schaefer, the owner of the farm that I visited, made the point that these landscapes in Lycoming County have been exploited over and over again over the years, and this, to him, is another chapter in that history of exploitation.
So Anthony Township shot down a data center application, but the situation there seems somewhat unresolved and a little bit messy. One thing that fascinated me was the NDA signed by a public official.
To be clear, Greg Moulter spoke in a public forum at the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors back in April, and I pulled some quotes from his talk there. But he is both an Anthony Township supervisor and director of the Montour County Planning Commission, and he did sign an NDA. I am not sure how many other officials in the county did also, but he advised against it, saying that it immediately makes you untrustworthy in the eyes of residents. And even if it's legal, and even if you see the point of signing the NDA as a public official. He advised against doing it because without having very precise legal guidance, there's not a lot that you can tell people to make them not suspicious if you've signed an NDA. There are valid reasons why developers would want to have people sign an NDA. They don't want their competition to know the details of their project, or they have an agreement with an end user who doesn't want to be identified, those kind of things. But again, that's in the interest of the developer, not in the interest of the public and transparency. So he advised against signing an NDA.
And you reported that officials voted to not recommend the project 6-1. So was he the vote the one?
So the Planning Commission voted 6-1. Gregory Moulter, I think, is the director. He doesn't vote. But the final decision was up to the county commissioners, who denied it unanimously. The township sends all of their land use applications to the County Planning Commission. The Planning Commission essentially recommends to the county commissioners whether or not to take action on a proposal like this rezoning request from Talon.
So you were just describing how Anthony Township is very rural and that it hands over its zoning affairs to the county, to Montour County. Can you elaborate or clarify a bit?
Yeah. About 2/3 of Pennsylvania communities have zoning ordinances in place, and those that don't will typically refer to their county government to review and approve or deny requests like Talon's rezoning. So in Montour County, there are a number of municipalities that don't have their own zoning ordinance, and they allow the County Planning Commission to review and approve or deny applications like Talon's. And that Planning Commission is typically made up of people from all over the county. So it's giving up a little bit of local control, but it's just, I believe, more efficient for a township that may only have a few hundred residents. It can be difficult to find people to volunteer to run the government. And that's why some of Pennsylvania's less populous communities don't have these layers of government oversight in place.
Okay. It seems like one of these proposals is going to end up in court any moment now. What do we know about the scope of counties or municipalities that have data center development guardrails in place? Is Anthony Township or is Montour County bracing for an appeal? And, data centers are new, but land development is not. And so what do we know about the legal bases for some of these, or the ability to withstand challenges and so on?
Well, in Montour County and Anthony Township, that decision was made back in February, I believe, finally. And as I understand, there has been no appeal, and the time for that would have passed. But Talon has been clear with the township, and they sent me a statement to this effect, that they are not walking away from Montour County and their land there. They are still engaging with the community, and by that I understand it to mean that they are inquiring about buying more land in the area. There is a challenge to the Middlesex rezoning. That was brought by a number of residents, and those folks are alleging essentially that the township supervisors approved the zoning for the data center solely to benefit the owners of that property in what's called spot zoning, which is where you create a zone for a particular use, and it's like an island in the middle of other uses. So what they have here is, rather than wait for the township to pass a new zoning ordinance, they did an amendment to the existing zoning ordinance with a data center overlay, which essentially is just an area where it says, yes, this is zoned agricultural residential, but you can also build a data center on this piece of property. Spot zoning is illegal in a lot of contexts because it is preferential to one property owner, and that's often to the detriment of other nearby property owners.
So you're leading right into the next question between mentioning Middlesex and the surrounding property owners. As you mentioned, this project is now being opposed by residents. They're saying, it's been was kept below the radar, and that is the reason it got off the ground with opposition. Zoning matters often require notification of nearby property owners, and that is then how sometimes people get wind of proposals that they might not be in favor of, etc. Did that notification happen here?
I'm not 100% clear on what the requirement was for them to notify nearby property owners, but my understanding is that it did happen and they did the minimum, which came down to legal notices in the paper and signs around the perimeter of the property. But the majority of people in the township never saw that. And people who oppose the Middlesex project told me they believe there should have been more of an effort to engage with township residents when the proposal first came to the township supervisors.
So in the story, you mentioned that data centers will have to report their power and water consumption to the State Department of Environmental Protection, and there's supposed to be better forecasting of power demands. That's as per 2 laws that were signed this summer by Governor Josh Shapiro. And that sounds like a good idea. Like it would create a baseline and afford some monitoring and or auditing. But are there concerns about that actually working? And then the second part of this question is whether there are additional law and policy changes, perhaps that some believe will be more impactful.
There were 2 pieces of legislation that were included in the budget and were signed as part of the budget by Governor Shapiro. When those will take effect and how effective they'll be remains to be seen. There's a regulation-making process that the DEP will have to go through for the power and water reporting, and then a lot of the framework behind the power forecasting falls to the Public Utility Commission. So those 2 agencies are going to have to figure out how to implement these requirements and then publish regulations, and that can take some time. There are other data center-focused bills that are teed up and could be conceivably passed in the last 3 weeks of this legislative session. Those involve moratoriums on new data center applications, like Muncie Township has attempted to do. This would clearly give municipalities the ability to adopt a resolution, which is less of a lift than passing an ordinance or a law. That would ideally give the communities that choose to pass those moratoriums time to update their zoning regulations to specifically deal with the issues that data centers bring. There's also legislation that would put into effect what Governor Shapiro called the Governor's Responsible Infrastructure Development Standards, again, aimed at data centers, and they would tie the sales tax break that data center owners receive on computer equipment and other materials for data centers to a set of benchmarks that they would have to meet in terms of securing clean energy and engaging with the community in their development process, job creation, and a few other things that would make data center developers think about the impact that they're having on the communities if they want to get that 6% sales tax break.
Understood. And finally, this is somewhat tangentially related, but it did stick with me, and that is that the first person the readers are introduced to in your story, John Schaefer, he and his uncle own a farmhouse that was built in 1769, making it the oldest in Lycoming County. And Some people might read that and wonder, how do we really know it's the county's oldest? How'd you fact check that? And you were there, so I'm curious what it was like being as old as it is.
John Schaefer and his uncle Malcolm Barlow own Muncie Farms, which is an 800-acre farm right on the west branch of the Susquehanna River. And the farmhouse, there's quite a bit of history that surrounds it. It was constructed by Samuel Wallace, who was a major colonial land speculator and surveyor up in that part of the state. And at one point, he held something like 7,000 acres along the west branch of the Susquehanna. He was also alleged to have been a British spy during the Revolutionary War who lamented raids on the settlers. And the settlers who were chased from their homes took refuge in Wallace's house because it was the only stone structure around at the time. And there are historical markers to that effect. The house itself, it's been expanded a number of times over the years, and the owners keep it almost like a museum. Before John's family owned it, it belonged to Henry and Margaret Brock, who were a wealthy couple who traveled the world, and they decorated the house with the arts and crafts that they brought back. And the really interesting part of the Muncie Farm story is that Margaret Brock was widowed later in life, and she adopted John's uncle Malcolm and his 3 siblings who were refugees from World War II in England. That was a thing that happened in and around London during the German Blitz. Was kids were sent either to the countryside in England or up to Scotland, or in this case across the ocean to the U.S., where they came to live with this couple in Lycoming County. It's a fascinating story. The New York Times did a feature on it last year, and I'd recommend that anyone look it up and read it if you have any interest in Muncie Farms. The farmland itself is special, too, because it's an 800-acre swath of Susquehanna River bottomland that has escaped the kind of development that has happened around it. I mentioned the mall, which is right across the street from Muncie Farms. And, I always feel privileged when I get to visit somewhere like that. Not entirely natural, but it's been pretty much unchanged for a couple hundred years.
You conclude the story by writing, and I'm paraphrasing in part, that other communities might look to these 3 townships for guidance on what they might want to do and what not to do. So I'm wondering what jumps out there for both of those, what to do, what not to do.
If I had to say what not to do, I think it would be don't be complacent about your local community and what's going on. Pay attention to what's going on in your local government. The Middlesex data center rezoning happened with very little public opposition, as we discussed, and it's not that there was no opposition. The meeting where they passed the rezoning, there were 4 people there. But it wasn't apparently enough to prevail on the township supervisors to think more about it, or to put the brakes on the project at least until they could think about it a bit more. Montour data center rezoning was denied because people really showed up and challenged the powers that wanted the zoning changed. So I think if you live in a place that has a lot of open space and a major power line or a power plant nearby, pay attention to the legal notices in your local paper, and get acquainted with your local officials by going to meetings. And you have a far better chance of hearing about these sort of developments before they hit the ground and get traction and are harder to change the course of.
I think that's good advice generally, something to think about generally, not just specific to this issue. So thank you very much for making the time.
It's always a pleasure to come on and to talk about my work. Thanks.
And I'm sure we'll be back here talking again about your work, perhaps about this very issue, since it's not going away.
I'm sure.
And actually, if you have a couple more minutes, I had a couple ideas while prepping for our conversation that I wanted to run by you.
Absolutely.
So when we were talking about the rules in Pennsylvania for notification of nearby property. Thank you for listening to Folo PA, the Pennsylvania Capital Stars podcast focused on how policy affects Pennsylvanians, featuring audio journalism that emphasizes context, accountability, and community impact. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you've heard, we'd love it if you'd recommend it to a friend. To stay updated on the latest episodes and other work by our team, you can subscribe to the Capital Stars newsletter, The Morning Guide, at penncapital-star.com, and we've included that link in the show notes. Our theme music is Dusk by Mr. Smith, courtesy of the Free Music Archive, licensed under an Attribution 4.0 international license. Folo PA is edited by the Capital Stars Editor-in-Chief Tim Lambert and hosted and produced by me, Emily Previti. Thanks again for listening.